Let's take a look at the correlation between the grand staff and the keyboard. In a previous lesson, we looked at how to read the grand staff. We looked at the treble clef, and we looked at the bass clef, and how to identify certain notes on the treble clef and on the bass clef. But now there are certain ways you can map the notes that we'll write on the grand staff with notes that will play on the keyboard. And I want to show you that today. Now, the typical keyboard has 88 keys. If you don't have a keyboard that has 88 keys, I encourage you to download an app or some kind of software on your computer or your smartphone or your tablet so that you can play along. And even if it doesn't have the full set of 88, it'll give you an idea of how the keyboard is correlated with the staff that we're going to use. So in order to figure out how we correlate the grand staff with the keyboard, first off, I want to look at the very middle of the grand staff. Now, that note right in the middle of the grand staff is what we call middle C. Now, in a previous lesson, we looked at how to find C on the keyboard by grabbing the group of 2 black keys, going to the very left. Now, this note here is what we call C. If you find the very lowest group of 2 black keys on a full 88 key keyboard, that's going to be called C1. Now, the next C above that, which is 8 notes away, if you look at the diatonic white keys, is going to be C2. And of course, the next one above that is C3. And then the one we're going to talk about today is the very next one, which is C4, or the 4th C on the piano. Now, this middle note in the staff is that C4. So go ahead and look at your keyboard and see if you can find the C4 or the 4th C from the left or the bottom side of the keyboard, and go ahead and play that right now. Now, once you find that C4, it should be right about in the middle of the keyboard. If you have a piano, oftentimes the Steinway logo or the Yamaha or whatever kind of brand piano you have, that branding piano will be right in the middle of your piano, and so that'll help you recognize if the C4 is there. If the C4 that you're playing is not under a logo, you may want to count again, because it might be that you went an octave too high or an octave too low. So now if we look at that C4 and we find that on our piano, the note above that is going to be our D4, which is right here on the staff, and it's going to correlate with this note right there on the keyboard. Now, as we work our way up the staff, we have an E, and then we have an F, and a G, and an A, and a B. Eventually, we'll get back to a C. Now, this C is actually called a C, but it's called C5. So we have C4, which is in the middle, C5, which is an octave above C4, and then of course we have, if you go an octave down, you'll find that that is C3. So there's a total of 8 C's on the keyboard, but on the musical staff, on the grand staff, there's only a total of 3 C's. So you may be wondering, well, how do we get to the other C's on the staff? Well, I'm glad you asked. Oftentimes we'll use ledger lines to go above the normal staff, and that will give us C6. And then if we go 2 ledger lines below, that'll give us C2. Now, that's only 5 of the C's. So in order to get to C7 or C8 or even down to C1, we have to continue to create ledger lines. Now, if that gets a little bit too hard to read, one of the shorthands or one of the little notational tricks that we can use is putting what's called an octave sign. We can put an 8 VA above that note, and that will tell the reader that we want the note that's 1 octave above the written note. And we can do that for anything. It doesn't just have to be a C. It can be for a D or an F or whatever, but they're going to end up playing it just like it is written, but an octave higher. Now, if we wanted to go 2 octaves higher, you would think it would be 16 VA, right? But in fact, it is actually 15 MA. And so if you count 15 notes up, you'll actually find that you're at the same note. So if you start on a C and count 8 notes, that'll be 1 octave, and then you count 15 notes from that initial C, and then you'll have your 2nd octave. So that is a way, it's a shorthand so that we don't have to keep creating ledger lines. And in fact, we can do that on the bottom as well. Now, instead of using MA though, we typically use VB. So we could draw something below here. That would be 8 VB, which would mean an octave below that, or 15 VB, which would be 2 octaves. Now, I don't think this note actually exists on most pianos. It might exist on some Bosendorfers that have extra keys, but for the most part, we have to be careful to make sure that the notes that we're writing on the staff actually exist on the instrument, because sometimes when we're working with violins or cellos or instruments with truncated ranges, they may not have all of the notes on the grand staff. So we want to be very careful to make sure that we're not telling the violinist to play a note that doesn't actually exist. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction to the correlation between the grand staff and the keyboard. I recommend taking some time, maybe 30 minutes or an hour, and just practice trying to find some of the notes on the keyboard. As I teach, I often want my students to practice multiple days on the same topic. So if you can dedicate 5, maybe even 10 days to the same topic, that would be really helpful. And oftentimes, as you do that, you'll become more familiar with the topics, and it'll become just kind of like speaking a language, and you won't even have to think about it anymore. It just becomes muscle memory, and it becomes rote. Well, I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next lesson.